Something isn't working, and you can feel it, not as a thought, as a weight. The harder you push, the further it moves. There's a logic almost no one questions. To have something, you must want it intensely, focus on it constantly, act on it relentlessly. This logic feels responsible. It feels like the adult thing to do. It feels like the only honest approach to building a life. But watch what actually happens when people apply it. The more desperately someone wants a relationship, the more the people around them pull away. The more someone forces a business decision, the more it stalls. The more someone tries to manufacture inner peace, the louder the noise gets. The more someone applies manifestation techniques with maximum intensity, the more the result seems to recede into the distance. This isn't bad luck. It isn't a deficit of faith or discipline or worthiness. It's coherence. Reality is being perfectly coherent with the internal state of the person who's trying. And the internal state of someone pushing hard carries, embedded within it, the information that something is missing, that something needs to be conquered, that absence is the natural condition of things. And reality responds to that information, not to the declared desire. That is the mechanism almost no one sees. Let me start with what appears to be a paradox, but isn't. The human mind was trained to operate in scarcity mode. Not because you are limited, not because life is cruel, but because the mind learned, across your personal history, that existing requires constant effort, perpetual vigilance, anticipation of threats, control over what might go wrong. That mode was useful. At some point, it protected you. It made you functional inside environments that demanded rapid adaptation. But it carries an invisible cost. When the mind operates in constant effort mode, it produces a specific internal frequency. Not in any vague or spiritual sense. In the sense of a cognitive and emotional activation pattern that organizes how you perceive reality, make decisions, interpret signals, and project intentions. And that pattern, when rooted in scarcity and control, creates a particular kind of perceptual field, one that amplifies evidence of what's wrong, what's missing, what hasn't arrived yet. The mind in effort mode perceives the gap before it perceives the possibility. This isn't philosophy. It's observable in anyone who has tried hard to control an outcome and watched the outcome slip further away despite the effort. There is an internal point that most people never reach intentionally. Not because it's difficult to access, but because the mind trained in effort cannot recognize it as valid. This point is what I call the 0 point, the neutral field. The place where the mind is neither wanting nor rejecting, neither projecting nor resisting, neither in conquest mode nor in flight mode. It is a state of momentary absence of identity. The Western mind struggles with this because it was conditioned to identify that state as passivity, surrender, lack of ambition, as though stillness were synonymous with stagnation. But stillness and stagnation are radically different things. Stagnation is immobility born from fear or resignation. The stillness I'm describing is active. It's lucid. It's a form of presence that isn't distorted by the urgency of a result. And it's precisely in that state that something interesting happens. Before I go further, I need to tell you about Elise. Elise is 43 years old. For 3 years, she tried to rebuild her professional life after leaving a corporate career she had outgrown. Not for lack of intelligence. She thinks in systems, understands structure, knows how to plan. But the more she planned, the more the ground seemed to shift beneath her. Every carefully built strategy encountered an unexpected variable. Every calculated step ran into invisible resistance. One afternoon, after a conversation with a potential partner that went nowhere, She walked out of a coffee shop, stopped on the sidewalk, and simply ceased to think. It wasn't a decision. It was exhaustion becoming clarity. She described it afterward as a few seconds where she wasn't Elise the strategist, wasn't Elise the anxious, wasn't Elise trying to solve anything. She was just someone standing on a sidewalk, feeling the faint warmth of afternoon sun on her left arm, hearing the distant sound of a passing bus. And there, without any effort, something reorganized. It didn't resolve everything immediately, but she walked away from that sidewalk with a clarity that 3 years of planning hadn't produced. A clarity about what she had actually been trying to control, and why that control was the source of the blockage itself. What Elise touched on that sidewalk wasn't resignation. It was the 0 point, the neutral field, the absolute silence between one thought and the next, where the mind, for an instant, stopped forcing reality to make sense on its terms. And reality responded. Let me undo a confusion that is almost universal. When most people hear, "let it flow," "release the outcome," "stop forcing," they interpret it as a passive instruction, as though the message were, sit down, wait, believe, do nothing. That interpretation is a costly mistake. Conscious non-action, what some traditions called Wu Wei, what behavioral scientists might describe as the absence of anxious interference, is not the same as the absence of action. It is the absence of action contaminated by anxiety. The difference looks subtle from the outside, but it's enormous in terms of results. When you act from forced effort, each decision carries the information of the fear of not succeeding. Every movement is a response to internal pressure, the sense that without this move, the result won't come. Action becomes a way to control reality, and reality registers that as imbalance. When you act from the 0 point, from the neutral field, action is born from a different source. It isn't a reaction to fear. It's a response to clear perception. The difference isn't in what you do. It's in the internal state from which you act. And that state completely changes the quality of the action. It changes what you perceive as possible. It changes what you communicate without words to the people around you. It changes the type of decision that feels obvious or impossible. Here's something that most personal development systems never confront directly. Identity is a filtering mechanism. When you have a very rigid identity, even a positive one, even the identity of someone successful, determined, focused, that identity filters what you can perceive as possible. Because the mind cannot process information that deeply contradicts the central narrative it uses to maintain internal coherence. This isn't weakness. It's architecture. The mind operates through patterns. Patterns reduce the energetic cost of processing the world. They are efficient, but they also create enormous blind spots. A person with the rigid identity of someone who fights will interpret every situation of ease as a trap, every unexpected opening as suspicious, every result that arrived without effort as something that will soon be taken away. Not because they're pessimistic, but because their identity has no internal model to process result that arrives with ease. That data doesn't fit the map, so the mind discards it or distorts it before it reaches conscious awareness. This is identity filtering, and it is invisible from the inside. The 0 point, the absolute silence, is the only state where identity enters momentary suspension, where the filter deactivates, where the mind can, for an instant, process information it would normally discard before it even arrived at consciousness. This is why genuine insights almost never arrive during effort. They arrive in the shower, on a walk, in the space between sleep and waking, in the moment after you finally stopped trying to find the answer. Those aren't accidents. That's the mechanism working. I need to name something that most people feel but can't articulate. There is a difference between wanting something and being in coherence with something. Wanting is a mental state. It's a narrative. I want this. It's declarative. Can be sincere, intense, repeated 1,000 times. But wanting is not the same as being internally organized to receive, sustain, and navigate what you want. Coherence is something else. It's when the internal state, the activation pattern you carry in a non-declared, non-thought, non-verbalized way, is aligned with what you say you want. When there is no contradiction between what you claim and what you feel as true about yourself and about what is possible for you. Most people who want intensely and receive little are living an unresolved internal contradiction. Not because they are flawed, not because they lack something essential, but because the deep internal map hasn't been updated. The mind is still operating from a model of itself that was built under conditions that no longer exist, but which the mind maintains out of inertia, out of habit, out of the absence of any interruption to the pattern. And it is impossible to update that map while the mind is in constant effort mode. Because constant effort is itself a way of perpetuating the old pattern. To update the map, the mind needs to stop. Not forever, not permanently, just long enough for the old pattern to lose its grip and for new data to be processed. That is what the 0 point allows. Let me make an observation that may seem counterintuitive but is structurally precise. The state of absolute silence is not an empty state. It is the state with the highest density of available information. Most people experience inner silence as absence, as though the quiet mind were doing nothing, as though that moment of pause were neutral, without content, without practical value. But observe what happens in the body when the mind genuinely stops producing narrative. The nervous system reorganizes. Peripheral perception expands. Details that were outside the frame of focus enter the field of awareness. Associations that the active mind would never make emerge naturally. Connections between scattered pieces of information consolidate without conscious effort. Absolute silence isn't the absence of processing. It's processing without interference. It's the mind functioning without the additional cost of simultaneously managing the identity narrative, the anxiety about the result, and the vigilance over what might go wrong. When those costs drop, even briefly, what remains isn't emptiness. It's pure processing capacity. It's perception without distortion. And in that state, the mind can see what was always available but was outside the perceptual field because the internal noise was too loud. Here's a question worth asking with precision. Why do most people never experience this state intentionally? Not because it's difficult to reach. At the technical level, it's one of the most accessible states the mind can produce. It happens spontaneously all the time, between two thoughts, at the edge of a dream, at the end of an exhale. The problem isn't access. It's recognition. The mind trained in effort has learned to recognize value only in states of activity. In states where something is being produced, planned, controlled. Where there is measurable movement toward a goal. Silence, to that mind, doesn't feel valuable. It feels like an interval. A pause between the things that matter. But what if the pause were exactly where the mechanism functions? What if the interval weren't empty space between two important actions, but the very state where the next action is recognized as necessary, possible, and coherent? That would completely change the relationship with non-doing. Not as a relaxation technique, not as a wellness practice, but as a structural component of the creation process itself. Let me dismantle something that seems solid but isn't. The idea that manifesting is an act of will. Will is real. intention is real, desire is real, but none of them on their own produce internal coherence. And without internal coherence, none of them is sufficient to reorganize the mind's filtering pattern. You can want with all your will. You can visualize with clarity. You can affirm with conviction. You can build vision boards, morning routines, intention rituals. And if the deep pattern, the model the mind uses to process what is real about you and what is possible for you, hasn't been updated, all those practices will operate on an unstable foundation. Not because the practices are worthless, but because they're being applied at a surface layer while the deeper layer remains intact. The deep layer doesn't respond to declarations, doesn't respond to repetition, doesn't respond to visualization. It responds to direct experience of a different state. And the different state cannot be forced, can only be allowed. Here is where the reverse mechanics enter with precision. Most manifestation approaches work from the outside in. Change your thoughts, change your actions, change your results. That logic isn't wrong, but it's incomplete, because it doesn't address the deepest layer, the internal state from which thoughts emerge in the first place. You can change the content of your thoughts, but if the internal state generating them hasn't changed, you're planting different seeds in the same soil. Same pH, same composition, same limits. The reverse mechanics work the other way. State first, then perception, then thought, then action. When the internal state genuinely shifts, when the mind touches the neutral field, the 0 point, the absence of identity for long enough that the old pattern loses dominance, the thoughts that emerge afterward are different without effort. The perceptions that arise are different without force. And the actions that emerge from those perceptions and thoughts carry a different quality. They aren't reactions to the fear of not succeeding. They are responses to a clearer reading of reality. This doesn't mean difficulty disappears. It means you're no longer adding the extra cost of forced effort to every move you make. I want to pause here and name something that stays too implicit in almost every discussion of this topic. Coherence is not positivity. I'm not describing a state where everything feels good, where anxiety disappears, where you feel deserving of everything and certain the universe is on your side. That kind of state can be produced, but it's unstable. It oscillates with external reality. It depends on favorable conditions to sustain itself. And it frequently masks the deeper layer rather than reorganizing it. The coherence I'm describing is more sober than that. It's the state where the mind isn't in conflict with itself, where what you feel is true about the situation, what you perceive as possible, and what you're willing to do from there are aligned. Not harmoniously, not euphorically, just aligned. Without the constant interference of the narrative that something is fundamentally wrong, that you aren't enough, that the result will escape you, that the effort must be even greater. That absence of internal interference is coherence. And it produces different results not because it's magical, but because the internal state you carry directly influences what you perceive as available, what you communicate wordlessly to the people around you, and the type of decision that feels obvious or impossible. There is a pattern that repeats with high consistency among people who have gone through real transformations, not the dramatic and instantaneous kind, but the ones that prove durable. The pattern is this: the turning point didn't happen when they tried harder. It happened when they stopped trying in the way they had been trying until then. That isn't coincidence. When the mind stops operating in force conquest mode, it can finally process information that the urgency state made inaccessible. It can see connections the effort was blocking. It can recognize possibilities that were in the perceptual field but that the identity filter was automatically discarding. The apparent paradox is that stopping is not giving up. It's removing the interference that was preventing the mechanism from functioning correctly. Think of a radio transmission. The signal is available. It always was. But if the receiving device is generating enough internal noise, the signal doesn't come through clearly. You don't solve that by increasing the transmission power. You solve it by reducing the noise in the receiver. The 0 point, the absolute silence, is the reduction of noise. And when the noise drops, the signal that was always available begins to arrive. I need to dismantle a resistance that many people will feel here. If I stop pushing, won't I stagnate? Isn't that irresponsible? That resistance is legitimate, and it reveals something important. The mind that learned to move through effort deeply distrusts stillness. To that mind, the absence of tension feels dangerous. It feels like negligence. But notice, that distrust is itself part of the pattern. It's the scarcity mechanism self-preserving. It's the identity of someone who needs to fight, resisting the possibility that constant fighting isn't necessary. And that resistance is exactly what needs to be recognized, not fought, not suppressed, just observed. Because when you observe the resistance without trying to resolve it, without trying to justify it or eliminate it, it loses strength. Not instantly, but progressively. Conscious non-action doesn't eliminate action. It changes the quality of action. Instead of action as escape from fear, you have action as response to clear perception. Instead of doing a great deal because you're afraid nothing will happen otherwise, you do what the situation actually requires. Less volume, more precision, less noise, more signal. Let me enter a layer that is frequently ignored. The role of time in the process of internal reorganization. Most people who try to shift their internal state want immediate results. They want to feel the difference in days. They want to see external evidence in weeks. That isn't impatience. It's the logic of effort being applied to the process of releasing effort. And that creates a structural problem. Because the process of internal reorganization, of updating the deep map the mind uses to filter reality, doesn't operate on linear time. It doesn't obey a calendar. It doesn't respond to goals. It operates through saturation and dissolution. The old pattern needs to be observed enough times for the mind to recognize that it is a pattern, and not reality itself. That it's a construction that was useful at some point, but that doesn't describe what is true now. That recognition can happen in an instant. It can take weeks of gradual exposure to different states, can deepen in successive layers across months. What accelerates the process isn't more effort. It's more quality of exposure to the neutral state, more moments of absolute silence, more instances of observation without reaction, more experiences where the mind touches the neutral field and discovers it didn't collapse. Because part of what keeps the old pattern active is the implicit fear that releasing control will produce chaos. And that fear only dissolves through the repeated experience that silence doesn't destroy. That the absence of effort doesn't produce free fall. That there is support in the 0 point. Here's something that needs to be said clearly. The process I'm describing isn't for every person in every moment. There is an important difference between someone who is in a genuine moment of internal reorganization, where silence and the neutral field are the natural next step, and someone who is avoiding real responsibility and using the vocabulary of non-effort as cover for inaction driven by fear. Those two situations look identical from the outside. Sometimes they look identical from the inside. The difference isn't in external behavior. It's in the honesty with which a person can look at what is actually happening in their internal state. Someone genuinely in the 0 point process feels lightness. Not euphoria, not certainty about the result, but a specific quality of clarity that doesn't come accompanied by urgency. Someone avoiding through inaction feels concealed discomfort. They feel like they're trusting the process, but there's an underlying tension that the discourse of releasing isn't actually releasing. An unease that the language of letting go isn't, in truth, letting go. Recognizing that difference in yourself is part of the work. There is an observation I make consistently about people who have reliable results in their lives, regardless of the field, regardless of the type of result. They don't operate in chronic urgency mode. Not because they don't care, not because they're indifferent to the outcome, but because they've developed, through experience, through observation, through necessity, a capacity to act without the action being contaminated by anxiety about the result. They can be completely present in the process without the mind simultaneously monitoring obsessively whether the result is arriving. That state isn't natural for most people. It's a developed capacity, and it's generally developed after trying hard enough with forced effort to recognize that the model doesn't work the way they assumed. The 0 point isn't the starting place for these people. It's the destination of a process of healthy disillusionment with the myth of effort as a guarantee of outcome. And once that state becomes intentionally accessible, not as an occasional accident, but as a navigable state, the quality of actions changes. The quality of decisions changes. The quality of what is perceived as possible changes. I want to unfold something that stays implied but deserves to be made explicit. The absence of identity I'm describing isn't permanent. It isn't a long-term destination where you arrive and never return to your habitual state. That would be a different kind of confusion. Identity is functional. You need it to operate in the world, to make decisions, to maintain relationships, to execute projects. What the 0 point offers isn't the elimination of identity. It's the reduction of its rigidity. A rigid identity can't be updated. It resists information that contradicts it. It filters reality in progressively more limiting ways as the world around it changes, and it doesn't. An identity with enough flexibility can incorporate new information without collapsing. It can recognize when an old pattern no longer serves without treating that recognition as an existential threat. And that flexibility is cultivated primarily through regular contact with the state where identity is in suspension, where the mind isn't so firmly anchored in who I am that it can't process what is being perceived. Each time you touch the absolute silence and return, you lost nothing, you didn't collapse, you didn't dissolve. The identity learns that the boundary between who you are and what is possible is more permeable than it assumed. And that changes everything. There is a time structure that appears consistently in processes of real transformation. First, someone tries, with intensity, with technique, with effort, and the results are partial, unstable, dependent on favorable external conditions. Then something breaks, not necessarily in a dramatic way. Often it's simply an exhaustion that arrives at a specific point, a perception that the model being used isn't producing what it promised. And then, in that space of lucid exhaustion, something different becomes available. Not because exhaustion is magically transformative, but because exhaustion interrupts the effort pattern long enough for the neutral field to become accessible for an instant. The problem is that most people, when they touch that neutral field by accident, don't recognize it, don't know how to name what they're feeling, don't have a map for that state, and so they return to effort, because effort at least is familiar, because effort at least has the shape of something being done. What I'm building here is a map, not a guarantee, not a technique, a map that allows you to recognize the neutral field when it appears, and progressively to access it intentionally rather than waiting for the exhaustion that forces it. Let me say something about the mechanics of perception that is central to everything here and that is rarely addressed directly. You don't perceive reality as it is. You perceive reality as you are. This isn't a figure of speech. It's the basic functioning of the perceptual system. The brain doesn't process everything entering through the senses. It processes a minimal fraction. And what determines what enters conscious awareness is the set of expectations, models, and patterns the system already carries. This means two people in the same situation aren't perceiving the same situation. The person carrying a scarcity pattern will perceive the elements of the situation that confirm scarcity. The person carrying a possibility pattern will perceive the elements that confirm possibility. Not because one is more optimistic than the other, but because their perceptual systems are literally filtering different realities from the same field of data. And when the internal state genuinely shifts, when the neutral field is reached and held long enough for the old pattern to lose dominance, the perceptual filter updates. Not dramatically, but visibly. You begin to perceive connections that were previously invisible. Possibilities that were previously automatically discarded. Signals that previously didn't reach conscious awareness because the system filtered them as irrelevant. This isn't manifestation in the vague sense of attracting vibrations. It's the reorganization of the perceptual system that determines what you can see in the field of data that reality presents. There is an observation I make consistently when looking at what distinguishes people who sustain durable transformations from those who live cycles of progress and regression. People in cycles often have very high intensity, deep commitment, sophisticated technique, extensive information about what to do. What they don't have is stability of state. The internal state oscillates too much in response to external stimuli. A week of good results and the internal state rises. A week of poor results and the internal state falls. And with the state, everything oscillates. The perception of what's possible, the quality of decisions, the way interactions unfold. That oscillation is the real problem, not the lack of effort, not the lack of technique. Desire. The field of possibilities, whether you want to call it quantum field, perceptual environment, reality in a state of potential, has no preferences about what you want. It responds to what you are. And what you are is defined not by what you desire, but by the coherent state you sustain. When you are in intense desire, the field you are is someone who doesn't yet have what they need. And the external field, responding to what you are, organizes around that identity. Not to punish you because the system is indifferent to punishment, but because the system is precise. It reflects. When you are in absolute silence, at 0 point, in the absence of anxious identity, the field you are is no longer defined by lack. And the external field, without a scarcity identity to reflect, begins to organize in ways that would have been invisible when the scarcity identity was active. It is not that the universe hears your silence and decides to help you. It is that you, in silence, perceive and act in different ways. And these different ways, broader perception, clearer decisions, action without reactive tension, produce different results in the real world. The mechanism is verifiable. You don't need to believe in metaphysics to recognize it. You only need to honestly observe what happens when you are tense versus when you are at peace. What you perceive, what you decide, how the people around you respond, what kind of opportunities you can see. That is the field responding. And it has always been responding. The question is, what are you being coherent with? There is a specific transition point at which internal work begins to produce what we are calling genuine coherence. And it is worth describing this point because it frequently goes unnoticed, And when it is not recognized, the person may abandon the process exactly when they are closest to what works. The transition point looks like this. You begin to notice that there are moments when the urgency simply isn't there. You think about what you want and don't feel the habitual tension. Not because you gave up, but because the relationship with the objective has changed. It is real, it is yours, but it doesn't define who you are in this moment. These moments are brief at first. A conversation that flows in an unusual way. A decision that makes itself with improbable clarity. A situation that resolves without the effort you had planned. The temptation, in these moments, is to interpret them as coincidence or temporary luck. But if you observe carefully, you will notice a consistent correlation. These moments happen when you are, in some way, more internally quiet, less burdened by the narrative, more present in what you are doing. This is not coincidence. It is the mechanism becoming visible. And as you recognize the mechanism, it begins to operate more frequently. Not because you are trying to reach it, but because recognition itself is enough for the state to become more accessible. Let's talk about the nature of effort one last time, because there is a crucial distinction I want to make clear before moving forward. There is physical and intellectual effort, what you apply to learn a skill, build something, create a project. This type of effort is neutral. It is not the problem. The problem is what we could call existential effort, the effort to prove you deserve it, to compensate for a perception of inadequacy, to force reality to confirm that you are enough. This type of effort is not productive. It is reactive, and it contaminates every action with attention that the environment perceives and responds to. When you act with existential effort, even correct actions produce different results than when you act from coherence. Because action with existential effort carries with it the signal that the current state is insufficient. And this signal is perceived by yourself, by the people around you, by the entire field of possibilities you are navigating. Removing existential effort does not mean working less. It means working from a different state. And that different state changes the quality of every action, every decision, every interaction. The null state emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it is a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment and not through tension. It is not mandatory. It is for those who feel that what was discussed here makes sense and want to go deeper into this internal investigation. For those who perceive that the answer is not in more technique, but in understanding with more precision the mechanism that is always operating. The link is in the pinned comment, if this makes sense to you. Let's arrive at what is perhaps the most important point of everything discussed here, and also the least obvious. Everything we have examined, silence, the neutral field, the absence of anxious identity, genuine coherence, can be understood intellectually without producing any real change. Conceptual understanding is a step, but understanding is not the state. You can completely understand how silence works and still be completely stuck in noise. Knowledge of the mechanism is not the mechanism. What produces change is not knowing this. It is direct. Stability of state doesn't mean the absence of emotion. It doesn't mean impassivity. It means the internal state isn't entirely at the mercy of what happens externally. And that stability is built through repeated access to the neutral field. Each time the mind touches the 0 point and discovers it can return to a state of relative clarity regardless of external conditions, that capacity consolidates. Not as a superpower, as a muscle, as a navigable skill. I need to address something about how effort disguises itself. Forced effort doesn't always appear as obvious tension. Often it appears as commitment, as responsibility, as seriousness. I need to always be active because there's too much at stake. I can't relax because things aren't resolved. Rest is a luxury I can't afford right now. Those thoughts seem reasonable. They seem mature. But they are the scarcity pattern in self-preservation mode. Because what they are actually saying is, constant effort is what separates the result from failure. And that belief, when it's the operating foundation, produces exactly the internal state that prevents the mechanism from functioning correctly. Not because rest is the answer, but because the belief that constant effort is the only protection against collapse generates a state of chronic vigilance that is incompatible with clear perception. And without clear perception, actions are decisions made with incomplete data. They are moves in a game where you're only seeing part of the board. The neutral field doesn't resolve this magically, but it interrupts enough for the complete board to become visible for a moment. And one moment of complete visibility is worth more than hours of intense movement in the dark. Let me make an observation about language that is more important than it appears. The way you talk about what you want reveals the internal state from which you're operating. I need X, and I'm moving toward X, are statements that look similar but emerge from radically different states. I need carries the information of absence as present reality. The mind that needs is operating from the perception that X doesn't exist, and that its absence is the natural state of things. I'm moving toward X doesn't deny the present absence, but it places the movement as the current state, not the lack. This isn't forced optimism. It isn't verbal reprogramming. It's observing that language doesn't merely reflect the internal state, it also reinforces it. And that changing the way you name what's happening, when that change is genuine and not cosmetic, can be part of the process of updating the internal map. The word need, when loaded with chronic urgency, is the scarcity state expressing itself. Observing that not to correct it immediately but to recognize what it reveals, is itself a form of access to what's operating below the declared level. There is a point in the process that is critical and frequently misunderstood. The moment when the old pattern manifests with force is not a sign that the process has failed. It's a sign that it's working. When the mind begins to have contact with the neutral field, with the 0 point, with the absence of identity, the old pattern often intensifies before it dissolves. This is mechanics, not drama. It's like pressure inside a system being reorganized. Before the new pattern stabilizes, the old one tries to reassert itself. And it often tries to reassert itself with more intensity than its usual frequency. The person who doesn't understand this mechanism interprets that increase in intensity as evidence that the process isn't working. They give up, return to forced effort, and the cycle restarts. The person who understands this mechanism recognizes the increased intensity for what it is, the signal that the pattern is being challenged to the point where it needs reinforcement. And with that recognition, instead of reacting to the pattern, they observe it. And observation without reaction is what allows the pattern, finding neither the resistance nor the capitulation it usually encounters, to simply dissolve. I want to build a distinction now that will make all of this more applicable. There is a difference between accessing the neutral field occasionally, as happens by accident in the shower or on a walk, and developing the capacity to access it intentionally when external pressure is high. Accidental access is valuable. But it isn't sufficient to reorganize deep patterns because it happens primarily when conditions are favorable, when there's already no tension, when the effort has already ceased because the situation has passed. What transforms patterns in a durable way is the capacity to touch the neutral field even under conditions of pressure. to find the 0 point even when the situation is creating demand for maximum effort. That capacity isn't developed by force. It's developed through gradual exposure. You begin by accessing the neutral field in easy conditions. In moments of relative quiet, you learn to recognize the state, to know how it feels, to become familiar with its texture. And progressively, with repeated exposure, the mind learns it can navigate toward that state even when external noise is high. Not because the noise disappears, but because the capacity to find the 0 point no longer depends on the absence of noise. This is what it means to develop stability of state. Not impassivity. Navigability. There is something that needs to be said about results. Everything built here might sound as though the goal is the state itself, as though reaching the neutral field were the end in itself. It isn't. The neutral field, the 0 point, the absolute silence, they aren't destinations. They are conditions that allow the creation process to function more coherently. They are the state from which perception clears, decisions become more precise, and actions stop carrying the extra cost of anxiety. Results remain real. Situations continue to exist. Difficulties remain present. What changes is the quality of the internal state from which you navigate them. And that changes what you can see, what you can decide, what you can sustain. Not because you became a different person, but because the perceptual filter was updated. The internal map was reorganized. And the action that emerges from a clearer map has a different quality than the action that emerges from a map distorted by urgency. Results are the consequence, not the focus. When the focus is correct on internal state, on coherence, on the quality of perception, results arrive as the natural byproduct of decisions and actions of different quality. Not as a miracle, as a consequence. There is one last layer I need to name before closing. Everything said here is investigation, not doctrine, not a definitive method. It's a map built from observation of the mind, of its patterns, of the invisible mechanisms that organize human experience. Maps are useful, but maps are not the territory. What was described here can be the entry point for an observation you make of your own mind, your own experience, your own process. Not to confirm what was said, but to verify in direct practice what is true in your specific case. Because the observation of oneself, without judgment, without urgency toward a conclusion, with the lucid clarity of someone willing to see what's there, is itself a way of accessing the neutral field. It is itself a way of interrupting the pattern long enough for something different to become visible. And what becomes visible when the noise drops far enough is often simpler and more direct than any system could predict. The state of null emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it is a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment rather than through tension. It isn't mandatory. It's for whoever feels it makes sense. It's the natural continuation of this internal investigation, for those who want to go beyond understanding and develop the capacity to navigate this state in practice. The link is in the pinned comment. If something here touched a point you didn't yet know how to name, leave a comment with your name and one word, just one. That describes what you're feeling right now or what you recognized while listening. Could be silence, coherence, clarity, neutrality, stillness, surrender. One word, just one. I'm Daniel, and this is what I observed.